Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the next Hear from Expert session. I'm Richard Chaplin, Managing Partners Forum. Delighted to be your host for today. I actually don't do very much today. I'm introducing our presenter, and I'm obviously going to be there if needed if any issues emerge of a more technical nature. Hopefully they won't. If you're not familiar with Zoom, I'm sure most of you must be by now, given the way we all use Zoom all the time. The chat is there, so if you want to use that to communicate with us, that's great. You can also ask questions through the Q&A. I mean, we find in practice on this particular call, there usually aren't very many, and that's fine. It's not a problem because obviously hearing from experts is very much a listening situation. Today's conversation, what are we talking about? Well, marketing. Marketing is a principal discipline in management. People forget that sometimes. They think it's to do with PR or something. Actually, it is a core management discipline. And it's also one that if you look at the business schools, they will say that when you are in tough times, actually that's the time to invest more, not less, in your marketing. So a thought there, if I may. So what we've done is we, as you probably know, organize every week on our Friday call a poll and look at different issues. And one of the issues that we looked at in a certain amount of depth was, are the way that marketing expertise is being used currently, is that consistent with the way that people felt that marketing expertise should be used? If you like, the current versus the ideal, if you prefer that way. And we found some quite important and quite distinct gaps emerged. And so I thought, well, that's really actually merely matters because, you know, if marketing expertise is indeed part of the solution to some of the challenges that firms are facing, to actually not to be using the marketing expertise to full potential, in fact, even sometimes furloughing marketing people, so going the other direction, if you like, didn't really make a lot of sense. So I thought it would be really interesting to ask Leor Franks, who is, as you can see on the screen, the chair of our strategy and marketing group, to explore those poll findings in a bit more depth, as really as part of a campaign, so we can actually try and set the record straight for what is the contribution of marketing and what is the true value of marketing expertise. I think that's about enough for me for now. So I will hand you over to Leor, who's now suddenly appearing from nowhere, which is great. I was a bit nervous for a minute. I thought he'd sort of suddenly keeled over in the background, but not so. And so we've got a good number of people on the call today, which is excellent. And very much in your capable hands, sir. 20 minutes, as I said, the chat is there, Q&A is there. But if you don't feel the need to use it, it's not a problem because obviously the words of wisdom. And we are going to be recording this, so it will be available in the next day or two on the management libraries. So if you miss it, or if you've got others in your firm that you think ought to see it and they want to sign up in the usual way, then it's a free service. So very eager that they should share the news, because you can't have a campaign without people knowing what you're campaigning about. On which happy note, sir, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. As Richard said, I've recently taken on the role of chair of the strategy marketing group at the Forum, alongside my day job at Augusta. And I'm going to talk about the alignment gap, or the perceived alignment gap, between what it is that BD, marketing and comms folk do in professional service firms, and what is it that leaders and partners of professional service firms actually want them to do, particularly today in this very difficult situation we find ourselves in. And I have two inputs that I'd like to use for this chat. Richard's referred to one. One is the survey of 73 leaders of professional service firms that was conducted 4 weeks ago. And the other is my experience. I spent about 20 years in the professional services industry, originally as client-facing fee earner at Arthur Andersen and Ernst & Young, and then moved into BD and marketing. And the last 12 years or so, I've been in director roles at Deloitte, Ernst & Young, FTI, and most recently Chief Marketing Officer at Augusta. And in each of those four roles, the first task I've had as I've come into the role is to seek alignment and to build alignment between the goals of the business and the activities, the structure, the function of BD, marketing, comms. Sometimes that's involved significant change, sometimes it's been incremental, but I'll share some of those experiences and particularly the toolkits I've used to affect those changes in a moment. But first, I'd like to begin with the summary of data from the survey that was conducted. So This was firm-wide leaders, as Richard mentioned, managing partners and other executive members of professional services firms. And they were asked a number of questions about what it is they need and what it is they're getting from their function at the moment. And the data on screen is the gap between supply of those services and demand in terms of the need of leaders. And I'll talk through each of these groups and the specific points to try and illuminate what they are and the consequence of those. The three groups are what I describe as BD, marketing, comms, core services on the left of the graph. Then in the middle, sales support activity, if I can use the word sales without offending anyone. And thirdly, on the right, commercial or strategic advice that you'll see perhaps is more lacking, at least in the perception of managing partners, than some of the other areas. And just to be clear on what these data points are showing, the data points show the scale of the gap between supply and demand. So if I start on the left with the items in green, CRM, a very small gap. CRM services are obviously about the client data that firms hold, making sure it's up to date, that it's current, that it's used effectively in BD and marketing, that it's GDPR compliant. And what you see here is a small gap, nothing of consequence. It says that the CRM group is doing exactly what leaders of professional services firms want today. The second column is pitches, which is a core activity of BD in many firms, putting together the pitches, maybe designing them, creating the logic and the argument, responding to RFPs, for example. A small gap here. This is actually a negative number, indicating a small oversupply of pitch support today. I suspect that's a legacy of the structure of many firms in terms of the resourcing reflecting the structure before the crisis, as opposed to the level of activity today. But I won't dwell on that further because pitch support services are in a good place, as are core marketing comm services. Again, an oversupply of services, probably for the reasons I mentioned around pitches. And for me, these marketing comm services are things like collateral, events, thought leadership, the core disciplines that many people would think of when they're talking about BD and marketing comms. So the conclusion on that area of activity, the traditional areas of BD, marketing comms activity, is that they're in a good place and doing roughly what it is that leaders of firms want. So that's great, but there are big gaps elsewhere. And if I move on to the middle of the graph, the items in yellow, what I described as sales support. And there are three particular areas here with very large gaps. So the first column, sourcing. This is about identifying opportunities and bringing them into the firm in terms of intelligence, in terms of research. 26% gap between supply and demand, very significant, suggesting that in many firms that capability simply isn't there. The other area here that's aligned to it, which is also demonstrating a significant but slightly smaller gap, is direct sourcing of opportunities, people who actually go out and bring in the work. I've had people like that in my teams before, people who perhaps have a black book of contacts, barristers, clerks, for example. And that's a very specific skill set that many firms simply won't have recruited into their businesses, which could explain why there is that gap, evidenced by that large number there. The third area, which was more of a surprise to me around sales support that's lacking, is coaching, providing advice to partners and fee earners on how best to go into the market, how to present themselves, how to market themselves. The gap of 15 points there is quite large, and perhaps indicative of a need for some reorientation in some of the staff that we might have in some of our BD and marketing functions. But if I move now to the right of the graph in red, for good reason, commercial advice, or what you might describe as strategy. The first area is around change advice on how to shape and mold the business. 34% gap, easily the largest gap in the survey. And for me, that's probably because a lot of BD and marketing functions don't have people with that background. This was the area that I practiced in at the beginning of my career, but I know that many of my counterparts who are pure marketeers haven't got that skill set in their teams because they haven't been required to build it, so they haven't brought those people in. There are some firms, of course, that will have a strategy function, whether as part of BD or separately, but the gap here suggests that a lot of firms are crying out for that advice, as they are for advice around services, or particularly new or adjacent services, which today, given intense competition and new entrants into the market, is potentially relevant for mid-market incumbents. And this data point, 26%, suggests that there is a big gap around those skills to advise on new service offerings. Finally, pricing, again, 26%. Pricing to me is quite a technical skill set. It often requires people with in-depth knowledge of the product or service and the market, and an ability to build the financial models to put together the right pricing approach. Large gap there, suggesting there's a need to build those skills. So that's a summary of the situation. Traditional core BD marketing, very good place, roughly aligned, perhaps a slight oversupply in a couple of areas, possibly as a result of the downturn of inactivity over the last few weeks. On sales support, some pretty large gaps around intelligence and bringing in opportunities, but the biggest gaps are around the commercial and the strategic advice that leaders often look to their BD and marketing teams to deliver. And what is driving this? That's the question I'm sure many people are asking. I wouldn't have thought the data points themselves are surprising, because I know that a number of people on the call contributed to this survey 4 weeks ago. But the real question at hand is what do we do about this, and what's causing the problems that we see? And I see two drivers. One of them is probably alignment in terms of goals, and the other is in terms of alignment in terms of structure. And I'll come to the goals in a moment and a toolkit for resolving that. But the structural point is an interesting one to me. In 3 of my director roles, I've had the opportunity to break down silos and bring BD, marketing, comms together into one integrated team, because I observed that the business needed people to act on their needs and wanted fewer barriers to activity. But I know in many firms, potentially for good reason, brand, business development, marketing, communication sit in separate functions. And that potentially is one of the drivers. And if you'll indulge a brief analogy, a militaristic analogy, I think of the American military reorganization in the 1980s. And some of you will probably be wondering where on earth I'm going with this, but bear with me for a moment. We all know that the American military for a long time was the most foremost military power in the world. But in the early 1980s, the perception was they weren't as effective as they should be. For example, the conflict in Grenada, a small island, yet the Americans took a long time to resolve the issue. And the analysis that was conducted by the Reagan administration came to the conclusion that the 4 siloed structure of the military, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, was wonderful for training and skilling its staff, but wasn't wonderful for operational reasons, because the groups had separate lines of report, operated independently, and didn't collaborate. Most importantly, they weren't aligned to one point in the chain of command. They weren't aligned behind common goals. So the 1986 reorganization broke that. It left training and skilling of staff within the individual militaristic functions, but it brought the activities, the operations, into what they described as combatant commands, where representatives of all of the forces would work together on one objective. That's the end of the analogy, but the point I'm trying to make is the American military saw the benefit in bringing those functions together, and I've tried to do that as well in my time, and found it a very effective way of resolving gaps in alignment between the activities of staff and the needs of the business. Leaving that aside, I'd now like to talk briefly about a toolkit that one can use to drive alignment within the business. And this is not my own work, it's an established framework out there in the market. It's around auditing the needs of the business and then identifying what needs to be done to act on those. And it's 4 elements: goals, strategies, objectives, and tactics. The goals are very much about what the leaders of the business want to achieve. The strategies or the services provided should come from whoever it is that's structuring and running the BD marketing function. The objectives are the time-bound specific objectives for particular campaigns or programs, and the tactics are the investments, the things that people might want to act on. To bring that to life with an example, let's imagine that you run a mid-market law firm. Today you might feel yourself squeezed by larger law firms who are now offering consulting services to their clients to get a bigger share of their client's wallet, but also potentially squeezed by the large consulting firms who, for the same reasons, share a client wallet, are now offering legal services. So with those 2 drivers of squeeze, what do you do about it? You may consider offering new services, perhaps consulting services themselves. So that's the business goal. The next stage of this framework is the strategies or the services required to implement that goal. And that is where a good leader in BD marketing comms should come in to help to structure the resources and the action plan. And I have another framework in a moment for how to get to those. The objectives need to be time bound and have specific budgets around them, and the tactics are the business development or marketing plans, the specific actions the team will take. I could spend hours talking about those, but I know I've only got 10 minutes left, so I won't go any further into them. But if you imagine that's a realistic scenario, how do you get to the heart of what actually has to be done in terms of the provision of services? So this is my next framework, an audit of the services, the strategies required to implement business goals. I call it the Favorability Journey. I've written some articles about this in PM Magazine, for example. Again, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to give you an analogy. This time, fortunately, it's nothing to do with the military, but it's to do with alcohol. So cast your mind back to before lockdown. Imagine you were traveling overseas for business in a hotel bar, waiting for a client. You go into the bar and you want to order a nice bottle of wine to entertain your client with. You look behind the bar and there are 40 bottles on the shelf. The problem is you don't recognize any of the brands. You're in an unfamiliar market. And without recognition, how can you possibly choose from those 40 to find the one that you want to entertain your client with? You look more closely and you see that 10 of the 40 are produced in a region that you've heard of. That gives you some confidence because you recognize the region. So, you can narrow the 40 down to 10, but there's no one else in the bar. You've got no further data. How do you choose any further? Let's say you wander behind the bar and cheekily look at the labels of those 10 bottles and you realize that 5 of them carry an award logo from a wine magazine. And that gives you a little bit of confidence about the reputation of those bottles. Maybe it's just good marketing, maybe it's about quality, but at least it helps you narrow down to the 5 that you believe you could make a reasonable choice from. Finally, the bartender arrives. You have a discussion with the bartender, you explain what it is you like and what you're hoping to get out of the bottle. You build a relationship with the bartender and you trust the bartender's advice. And the bartender says, look, there are 2 of those 5 that you should choose from. One is $20 a bottle. It's great value, it's fresh, it's refreshing, it's light, it's exactly what you've asked for. The other one is the best bottle we have in the house, really well known, can't go wrong with it, it's $200 a bottle. So you have a decision to make about which brand you're going to give your revenue to. Which one are you going to purchase? Maybe you have to think about your client, and if they're in financial services and there are concerns about bribery, you can't go for the $200 bottle, but I'll leave that specific decision to you to consider. The point is, what are you going to get for your money? How much are you willing to pay at that point in time? Perhaps that's a real journey you might go on with the brand if you were in a bar waiting for a client. But perhaps it's also a realistic journey that you might go on running a professional services firm, or more important, your clients might go on with the brand. And I'll bring those 4 elements to life in a little bit more detail and explain how they are relevant to managing a firm and how they're relevant to identifying the services that are needed in BD and marketing to address the alignment gap I've talked about. If I start with recognition, recognition is about being known in the market as a firm that can offer the particular services your clients need. If you're in a situation where clients don't recognize you as a provider of that service, perhaps it's a new service for your business, you need to invest in staff and skills that can help build that recognition, whether that's website design, whether it's search engine optimization, whether it's the people who can get you into trade directories, which are very important. I won't go into all of the tactics, but that's an example of the kind of support you might need if recognition is a gap in the provision of services you have. Moving on, reputation. Reputation, I'm sure we're all very familiar with. It's about what does the market think of us? What do they react with when they see our name? And in terms of marketing and BD, for me, it's around managing the media, making sure our reputation in the media is sound. It's about thought leadership, making sure we have the points of view that are required and they're being distributed at conferences and direct to clients. And it's also about making sure that we have the right marketing collateral that talks about our skills and our capabilities. So you will obviously need the right people, the right resources who can do the PR, who can do the thought leadership, who can produce the marketing documents. The relationship piece is one that the survey we talked about a few minutes ago, I think, identifies as a big gap. And for me, this is around the intelligence to identify opportunities. It's about actually going out and meeting clients, training and coaching our fee earners to be as strong as they can in their management of client relationships. And that's a skill set, clearly, according to the surveys, is lacking in some areas, I think, because many firms haven't invested in that area in the past. And the final area of this toolkit, revenue, is about the actual sale. It's about the pricing. It's about making sure that you have the right mix of services and the right mix of people at that point in time. It's the commercial advice section of my graph earlier on, where there was a very large gap. So to summarize this favorability journey is about understanding where clients are with you today. And in my view, you should conduct an audit of your client base for each of the businesses within the firm. And when I've come into a new firm as a director of BD and marketing, this is exactly what I've done. And I've tried to do it at the most granular level possible, by which I mean, if possible, partner by partner, or business unit by business unit, or team by team. To give the example, when I joined FDI Consulting 2014, I had 110 partners to look after. And in my first month, I had 2-hour meetings with 73 of them. The goal being to really understand their needs, the goals of their business, and then to look at where they were in their journey with their clients, whether we needed to provide support about recognition, reputation, relationships, or revenue, or a mix of those. I did that in a bottom-up fashion, met all the partners, aggregated, consolidated the results, went back to the executive team of which I was part to make a case to restructure and invest in the team, which is exactly what we did and led to the structure that I built and ran for 5 years at FDI. So that's how I think one can conduct a services audit. And I think that's essential in order to make sure the right supply of BD and marketing is provided. And that's all I wanted to say on that toolkit. If I summarize, go back to the very first slide, the core BD and marketing services we've all experienced are doing well, according to the survey we conducted a few weeks ago. But the gaps really around sales support, intelligence, coaching of our fee earners, and particularly the strategic commercial advice about how to change the business, how to create new services, and particularly on pricing. In terms of what to do about that, the two toolkits I referred to, understanding the needs, the goals, strategies, objectives, tactics toolkit, being very clear, ideally at a granular level again, about what the needs are. And finally, comparing those needs to services on offer, this favorability journey toolkit, looking at individually, partner by partner if possible, where they are in the market, and as a consequence, what support BD and marketing need to provide.
One of the things that is actually quite interesting is the structural point you raised, Leor, around they may not have somebody with your depth of expertise, clarity about what's required. They may have been hiring people at a more junior level, marketing managers, maybe great people in what they do, but would feel a bit awkward in that space. And certainly at the moment, a lot of firms aren't hiring anybody in terms of the employees. But there is an answer to that to some extent, which is, of course, that actually, if you look at those commercial, the red areas, they are ones in which a certain amount of gravitas is needed in order to gain the attention of the relevant leaders. And therefore, actually, often it maybe make more sense to hire a consultant. We're talking here about marketing expertise, not necessarily marketeurs. It's a slight difference on employees. Hire a consultant who will come in maybe on an interim basis and actually do that exercise, because actually that's hugely helpful for the rest of the marketing team, because they possibly haven't been involved in that type of activity before. They may not have realized quite what value a senior marketing person can bring. And therefore, they shouldn't see this person as something of a threat to them, which some might. But actually, no, this is a really good way for us to upskill our expertise and then show we can deliver value to the firm that has employed us, even if possibly when they employed us, the role that they employed us for is not now the one which they require of us, which is always a challenge for many organizations, redeploying the people and finding new skills. I'd like to thank you, Leor, for your time, energy, and effort. The forum may have given you some numbers, but there was a lot more than numbers in your presentation, so thank you for that. As I said, the forum is interested in making sure this issue isn't just sort of parked in some video, but is actually brought to the fore. And the reason I say that is because actually, if you focus on clients, you have two quite strong needs from clients. One need is around the technical expertise. The other need is going to be around the management and leadership expertise associated with running the sort of challenging businesses that professional services firms are. It's much easier when everybody responds to an email and does what they're told, believe me. And so there is an argument, I think, and I always address this quite strongly, which says that actually you shouldn't just be focusing on your marketing people being able to help in those areas, but actually many of the clients of your firm may well find that conversation helpful as well, particularly in the current climate where a lot of their plans have been torn up and they're not quite sure what to do next. So again, cast your sort of horizons a little bit wider possibly, and think about how you and your marketing team as the leader can actually help your clients. And it may be you as the CEO goes and has a much more of a strategy and marketing conversation with your client, but with the CEO of the client rather than the traditional financial controller or GCO, whoever it happens to be. Because believe me, they will actually say, how do you cope in the really strange world that you live in that I can't even get my head around? But actually, you guys seem to do really rather well. So they must be getting something right. So I think there's a whole group of really important areas in which marketing expertise as a key discipline in management, which is really where I pitch it, can add huge value. And then fantastic tactics and approaches and strategies, which Leo's been through today. So